He was the kind of man everyone in the neighborhood recognized, though few truly knew his story. For years, the elderly black bus driver had followed the same routine, waking before the sun, putting on his neatly pressed uniform, and stepping into the chilly morning air to begin his shift. His back was bent slightly from age, his hands rough from decades of work, but his eyes still carried a quiet strength. The bus was not just his job, it was his life. Each morning he climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror, and gently rested his hands on the worn steering wheel. That bus had seen everything with him: rain, storms, laughter, tears, and silence. It carried school children with backpacks too big for their shoulders, tired workers returning from long shifts, and mothers holding babies close against their chests. And through it all, he drove with steady hands and patience. The passengers respected him. Some greeted him with smiles, some with tired nods, and others said nothing at all. But he noticed everyone. He noticed the boy who always ran late, chasing the bus at the last second. He noticed the old woman with the shopping bags who struggled up the steps. He noticed the teenager who always wore his hood low to hide his face. And no matter who it was, he treated them with kindness. A smile, a gentle word, or even just waiting an extra few seconds at the stop. These were his ways of showing care. Outside of work, his life was quiet. He lived in a modest home with peeling paint and a small porch where he liked to sit in the evenings. The neighbors often saw him there, sipping tea, nodding hello as children played in the street. He was not rich, not powerful, but he carried himself with dignity. His clothes were simple but always clean. His words were few but always respectful. People often underestimated him. To many, he was just another bus driver, an old man nearing the end of his working years. But those who paid attention saw more. They saw his discipline, the way he never missed a day of work, the way he stayed calm even when passengers were rude or impatient. They saw his patience, his kindness, his quiet strength. What most people didn't know was that he carried heavy memories. He had lived through hard times, through years when respect was not given to men like him. He had faced insults, struggles, and loneliness. But he never allowed bitterness to take root. Instead, he poured all of his energy into working hard and raising his family. His son, the pride of his heart, had grown into a man of discipline and honor, though the driver rarely spoke about it. He never bragged, never told passengers about his son's achievements. For him, being humble was more important than showing off. Every morning, as the bus rolled along its route, he watched the city pass by. The tall buildings, the crowded markets, the quiet neighborhoods, all of them were pieces of the world he served. Sometimes he thought about retiring, about resting his tired bones and living quietly. But then he thought about the passengers who depended on him, the children, the workers, the elderly. And he knew he couldn't stop yet. Driving that bus wasn't just work. It was his way of giving back, his way of keeping the world moving, even if just a little. Despite his age, he carried himself with pride. He didn't rush, he didn't complain. He took his time with every stop, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes watching the road carefully. Younger drivers sometimes mocked him for being too slow, but he didn't mind. He believed safety mattered more than speed, respect more than pride. In the evenings, when his shift was done, he would park the bus carefully, check the seats one last time, and walk home under the fading sunlight. His walk was slow, his steps measured, but his heart was peaceful. He had done his duty for the day. The community may not have realized it, but the old man was a quiet pillar of their daily lives. Without him, children would miss school. Workers would be late. Families would struggle. He carried the weight of many lives without complaint. But life has a way of testing even the quietest, humblest souls. He had no idea that soon his dignity would be challenged in a cruel way. He had no idea that arrogance would cross his path, threatening to humiliate him in front of others. Yet he also didn't know that behind his calm exterior, behind his old uniform and worn shoes, he carried a silent power. His son, the man the world called one of the most deadly Green Beret snipers ever trained. For now, though, his life remained simple. A bus, a uniform, a route he knew by heart. The world saw only an old driver, but destiny was waiting just around the corner, ready to reveal how extraordinary this ordinary man truly was. It was late afternoon, and the old driver's bus rattled slowly through the city. The sun hung low, painting the streets gold, and the passengers inside were quiet, lost in their own tired thoughts. The elderly man drove as he always did, steady hands on the wheel, eyes careful on the road. To him, this was just another day, another route, another set of passengers depending on him to get them home. But as he turned onto a narrow street near the edge of town, flashing lights suddenly appeared in his mirror. A police cruiser pulled up behind him, sirens wailing briefly before cutting off. The old man frowned. He hadn't broken any rules. His speed was steady, his bus signals worked fine. Still, he pulled the bus carefully to the side, as was his duty. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered, others pulled out their phones, curious to see what was happening. The elderly driver sighed, put the bus in park, and waited. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser. Their movements were sharp, heavy with arrogance. They weren't calm professionals doing their jobs. They were young, restless, and looking for power. Their eyes scanned the bus like hunters spotting prey. One of them smirked as he approached. "Step out of the bus, old man," he said. His tone wasn't polite, not even neutral. It was mocking, dripping with disrespect. The driver's brows knit together. He opened the door slowly and stepped down onto the pavement. His back was slightly bent, his hands steady but tired. He adjusted his cap and looked at the officers calmly. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked in his quiet, respectful tone. The second cop snorted. "Don't play smart. We've had reports of reckless driving. People said you were swerving." The driver blinked in surprise. "That can't be right. I've driven the same route for years. I follow every rule. My passengers can tell you." "Quiet," the first officer barked, stepping closer. "You think your word means anything?" The passengers stirred uneasily inside the bus. Some shook their heads, others whispered, "He wasn't swerving. He did nothing wrong." But the officers ignored them. The second cop circled the bus driver slowly like a bully circling a target. "License and registration," he demanded. "And hurry up. Don't waste our time." The old man pulled his wallet from his pocket with calm, deliberate movements. His dignity remained intact, but inside a storm brewed. He had lived long enough to recognize this kind of treatment. It wasn't about law. It wasn't about safety. It was about power, about mocking a man who looked too old, too ordinary, too easy to push around. One officer snatched the license from his hand and pretended to study it, though his smirk never faded. "Bus driver, huh? Figures." His voice carried a cruel laugh, as if the job was beneath respect. The driver kept his face neutral, but the sting landed deep. He had driven buses for decades, carried thousands of lives safely, worked harder than most men ever would. And here was a boy in uniform mocking years of honest labor. "Open the bus," the second cop ordered suddenly. "We need to check it." "For what?" the driver asked quietly. "For whatever we feel like," the cop shot back. He shoved the driver lightly on the shoulder, pushing him aside. It wasn't hard enough to knock him down, but it was full of insult. The passengers protested now, their voices rising. "This isn't right," one woman called out. "He hasn't done anything wrong." But the officers ignored them, climbing aboard, pretending to inspect seats and compartments, making a show of authority. Outside, the driver stood silently, his jaw tight. He didn't yell, didn't fight back. He had faced worse in his lifetime, and he knew shouting would only fuel their arrogance. Instead, he stood tall in his quiet dignity, letting their behavior expose itself for what it was. But inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: humiliation. They weren't just checking him. They were mocking him, stripping him of respect in front of the very passengers he had served faithfully. When the officers finally stepped back out, one of them shoved the license roughly into his chest. "We'll let you off with a warning," he sneered. "But watch yourself. Next time we won't be so nice." The bus driver nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. He climbed back into the driver's seat, his hands trembling slightly as he started the engine again. The passengers murmured words of comfort. "Don't worry, we know you did nothing wrong. We saw how they treated you, it was unfair." But the old man only gave a faint smile, his eyes on the road ahead. What the cops didn't know, what no one knew in that moment, was that their arrogance had set something in motion. They thought they were mocking a powerless old man. They thought they could walk away without consequence. But the elderly driver was not as alone as they imagined. He had a son the world whispered about in military circles, a son trained to see danger before it arrived, to protect without hesitation, a son who was the most deadly Green Beret sniper ever to serve his country. And when that son learned how his father had been treated, the balance of power would shift in ways those arrogant cops could never have prepared for. The bus rolled back onto the road, but the air inside was heavy. Passengers whispered in low voices, their faces tight with anger and unease. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered that they should have recorded everything. The elderly driver, however, remained silent. His hands gripped the wheel firmly, steady as ever, though deep down, he could still feel the sting of the officer's words and actions. For decades, he had lived with dignity, building his life through hard work and respect. He had driven safely through storms, through late nights, through long routes when his body begged for rest. He had raised his son with discipline, teaching him the values of humility, honor, and service. And now, after all those years of struggle, he had been treated like nothing. But the old man was not one to explode with anger. His dignity did not shout. It stayed quiet, calm, steady, like a flame that could not be put out. He knew that shouting back at the officers would only have made things worse. He knew they were looking for a reaction, something they could twist against him, so he gave them nothing. His silence was his shield. One passenger, a young woman, leaned forward and spoke gently. "Sir, you handled that better than anyone could have. Most people would have shouted. You didn't let them break you." He nodded faintly, offering her a small smile. Inside, though, he was replaying every moment. The shove on his shoulder, the mockery of his work, the way they had looked at him as if he were beneath them. It cut deep, not because he had never faced disrespect before, but because he thought times had changed. He glanced into the mirror and saw the faces of his passengers, people of all ages, backgrounds, and struggles. They looked at him with respect. They knew the truth. And in that moment he realized that dignity was not measured by how others treated you, but by how you carried yourself when they tried to strip it away. At the next stop, an elderly woman with a cane stepped off the bus. Before leaving, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than they'll ever be," she whispered. Her words were soft, but they warmed his heart. He drove on mile after mile, the city lights flickering past. His silence was not weakness. It was strength. A quiet strength that refused to bend, even under the weight of insult. When his shift ended that evening, he parked the bus carefully, checked every seat as he always did, and walked home with slow, steady steps. Neighbors greeted him, some asking why he looked so tired, but he only smiled politely and said, "Long day." He didn't tell them what had happened. He didn't want pity. He had survived humiliation before, and he would survive it again. At home, he sat on his porch with a cup of tea. The street was calm, the sound of children playing echoing in the distance. He breathed deeply, letting the cool night air wash over him. His mind replayed the scene once more, and again he felt the weight of the officer's arrogance. But then he thought of his son. His son had always told him, "You don't have to fight every battle, Dad. Dignity is stronger than pride." Those words came back to him now. He realized he had done the right thing. He had not given in to anger. He had not lowered himself to their level. He had stood firm, silent, but unbroken. Yet he also knew something else. His son, the Green Beret sniper the world whispered about, would not let this pass. His son had inherited the same sense of dignity, but he also carried with him the training, the authority, and the power to confront injustice directly. The old man had stayed silent, but his son would not. As the night deepened, the old driver sipped his tea slowly. His body was weary, but his spirit remained intact. He had been humiliated, yes, but his dignity was untouched. The cops had mocked him, shoved him, treated him as if he were worthless. But in his heart he knew the truth. Worth does not come from the opinions of the arrogant. It comes from living honestly, serving faithfully, and holding your head high no matter what. He didn't need to shout to prove his strength. His silence had spoken louder than words, and soon those officers would learn that the man they tried to belittle was not alone. His quiet strength was backed by a son whose skills and reputation made even the bravest soldiers tremble. For now, though the elderly driver sat quietly in the night, the steam from his tea rising gently in the cool air, he had endured the storm with calm. But destiny was preparing the next chapter, one that would shake the arrogance of those officers to its very core. The following day began just like any other. The elderly driver woke before dawn, ironed his uniform, and buttoned it neatly. He carried himself with quiet pride, even though the memory of yesterday's humiliation still lingered in his mind. He told himself it was over, that the best thing he could do was keep working, keep serving his passengers, and keep his dignity. But fate had other plans. As he drove his route that evening, turning onto a busy street filled with commuters heading home, flashing lights appeared once again in his mirror. The same officers. Their cruiser slid in behind him, sirens wailing briefly before cutting off. A cold weight settled in his chest. He already knew this was not about the law. This was personal now. He slowed the bus and pulled to the side. Passengers muttered uneasily, some already recognizing the situation. Again? One man whispered. A mother hugged her child closer. Phones appeared, their cameras quietly raised. This time people were ready to record. The officers stepped out, swagger in their steps. One smirked openly as if the whole thing were entertainment. "Looks like we meet again, old man," he said mockingly. "Didn't we warn you yesterday?" The driver remained calm, his voice steady. "I have broken no law. I am doing my job," the officer sneered. "Your job? Driving this old tin can around? Don't talk back." He shoved the door open and climbed aboard the bus. His partner followed, eyes scanning the passengers like they were suspects. "Everyone stay in your seats," the first cop barked. "We're conducting a search." A young passenger raised his phone higher, filming. "What for?" "He didn't do anything." The officer whipped his head around. "Put that phone down or you'll be in cuffs too." The bus went silent. Fear rippled through the passengers, but their eyes betrayed anger. They could see the truth. This was no lawful inspection. This was harassment, plain and cruel. The elderly driver stood at the front, his hands gripping the rail for balance. He didn't move, didn't argue. His silence was not weakness, though the officers mistook it for submission. He was simply refusing to give them what they wanted. Anger, resistance, a reason to escalate further. But escalation came anyway. One officer pushed down the aisle, yanking open overhead compartments, tossing out bags, scattering people's belongings onto the floor. A woman gasped when her groceries spilled, fruit rolling under the seats. The officer only laughed. The second officer stepped close to the driver, his face inches away. "What's the matter, old man? No smart words today? You think standing there quiet makes you strong?" He jabbed a finger into the driver's chest. "You think your age earns you respect? Newsflash, it doesn't." The bus driver inhaled slowly. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Respect is not yours to give or take. Respect comes from within." The officer's smirk faltered for a second, but pride pushed him further. He shoved the driver lightly against the rail. "Don't test me," gasps filled the bus. A child began to cry. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, anger growing like fire beneath the silence. Some whispered, "This is too much." Others muttered, "He's done nothing wrong." The bus was no longer just a vehicle, it was a stage, with injustice unfolding in plain view. And yet the old man remained steady. His silence carried more power than shouting ever could. His calm presence made the officer's aggression look small, childish. Still, they didn't see it. They only saw what they wanted to see, an easy target. After tearing through the bus, the officers returned to the front. "Nothing here," one said carelessly, as if admitting it didn't matter. "But we'll be keeping an eye on you." They pushed past the driver, climbed out, and slammed the cruiser door behind them. With a screech of tires, they sped away, leaving behind a bus full of shaken passengers and an old man standing tall in the silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a young man near the back stood up. "Sir," he said, voice trembling but loud enough for all to hear, "you didn't deserve that." "We all saw. We all know," others nodded. A woman added, "You stood stronger than anyone could have. They tried to break you, but they couldn't." The driver gave a faint smile, though his heart felt heavy. He had endured. But he knew this would not end here. Men like those officers didn't stop when their pride was challenged. They pushed harder. And he sensed, deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning of something bigger. What he didn't realize was that his quiet endurance was about to collide with something else, something far greater. Because while he carried his burden in silence, someone else was listening. His son, the Green Beret sniper whose very name carried weight in military halls, the son who had been trained to fight battles most men could not even imagine. The officers thought they had harassed only an old bus driver. They had no idea they had stepped into the shadow of someone far more dangerous than they could ever comprehend. The bus driver returned home late that night, his uniform wrinkled, his body weary but his dignity still intact. He sat quietly on his porch sipping his tea, watching the moon rise above the rooftops. On the surface he looked like any tired old man finishing another long shift. But inside his heart was heavy. The humiliation from the officers' harassment weighed on him. He replayed their mocking voices, their shoves, their laughter. He wasn't angry for himself. He had endured worse in his lifetime. But he hated that it happened in front of his passengers, in front of children, in front of those who trusted him. He had chosen silence. He had chosen dignity. But silence does not always mean weakness. Sometimes silence hides deeper truths, because this elderly man was not as powerless as the officers believed. He carried a connection stronger than any badge, stronger than any uniform, stronger than any arrogance. That connection was his son. His son was not like other men. From a young age, he had shown discipline, courage, and strength. While other boys played, his son trained. While others wasted time, his son pushed himself to his limits. He had grown into a soldier, a warrior shaped by sacrifice and fire. And not just any soldier. He became a Green Beret sniper, one of the most skilled and feared in the world. His record was whispered in military halls. Missions that seemed impossible he had completed. Targets others missed, he hit with precision that defied belief. His comrades respected him deeply. His enemies feared him. He had seen war, faced death, and survived battles that most men could not even imagine. Yet for all his deadly skill, he carried humility like his father. He did not brag. He did not boast. To strangers, he was just another man. But to those who knew he was a legend, the kind of man whose presence commanded silence, whose eyes told stories no one dared ask about. The old bus driver rarely spoke of his son. Not because he wasn't proud, he was proud beyond words, but because he believed true greatness did not need to be shouted. He kept his son's achievements close to his heart, knowing that the world didn't need to know. What mattered was that his son lived with honor, with respect, with courage. But now, as he sat on his porch, the old man thought of him. He thought of what had happened, the way the officers mocked and shoved him. He thought of how they believed he was powerless. And for the first time in many years, the old man wished his son had been there. Not to fight, not to hurt, but simply to stand beside him and show those men the truth. That respect is not optional, that dignity is not weakness. The next morning, his phone rang. It was his son's voice, strong and steady, yet touched with concern. "Dad," he said, "I heard what happened." The old man's heart sank. He hadn't wanted his son to know. He didn't want to trouble him, didn't want to pull him into the ugliness of what had happened. "It's nothing," he said softly. "I handled it." But his son was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his tone was firm. "It's not nothing. They put their hands on you. They disrespected you, and that means they disrespected me." The father sighed, sipping his tea slowly. "I stayed calm. I chose silence. That was enough." His son's voice grew colder. "You taught me dignity. You taught me respect. But you also taught me never to let injustice pass. You may choose silence, Dad, but I cannot." The old man closed his eyes. He could hear the resolve in his son's words. The same steel he had heard years ago when his boy first enlisted, when he first swore to serve with honor. He knew his son would not let this go, and in that moment he felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride because his son had become a man of principle, fear because he knew what his son was capable of, relief because perhaps finally those officers would learn the lesson they so desperately needed. The old man had carried his dignity in silence, but his son was a Green Beret sniper, the most deadly the world had ever known. A man trained to end wars before they began, to strike fear into enemies with precision and power. The officers had mocked an old bus driver. What they didn't realize was that the blood of a warrior ran in his family. And now that warrior knew the truth. The game had changed. The call with his father echoed in his mind long after it ended. The Green Beret sat in silence, his phone still in his hand, staring at the wall. He had been trained to stay calm under fire, to keep his emotions hidden, to act with precision rather than anger. But now, for the first time in a long while, his blood boiled. His father, the man who had raised him with discipline and honor, had been mocked, shoved and humiliated by men who wore uniforms but did not understand what the word service truly meant. It wasn't just disrespect. It was a wound to everything his father represented. He thought back to his childhood, the way his father woke before dawn to drive the bus, the way he came home tired but still found time to teach him lessons about respect and humility. His father had never been rich, never powerful, but he had given him the greatest gift of all, values. And now that man, that pillar of quiet strength, had been treated like dirt. The sniper clenched his fists. He had seen war zones where enemies underestimated him, and he had made them regret it. But this was different. This was personal. This was not about medals or missions. This was about family. He pulled out his laptop and began searching. Within minutes, he found the videos passengers had recorded on their phones. The internet had already picked up the story. Clips showed his father standing calmly as the officers barked at him, shoved him, and tore through the bus. His jaw tightened as he watched. His father hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't lost control. He had stood tall in silence, embodying the dignity he had carried all his life. The son's chest swelled with pride, but also burned with fury. His father had done nothing wrong, and yet those men had treated him like nothing. The sniper knew one thing: this was not over. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance, and planned. His training whispered to him, observe, analyze, prepare. He wasn't going to storm in recklessly. That was not his way. He would confront this with the same precision he had used in the field. Quiet, sharp, undeniable. By morning, his decision was made. He drove out toward his father's neighborhood, the hum of the engine steady, his mind focused. He wasn't going there as a soldier on duty. He wasn't going there with weapons or camouflage. He was going there as a son who would not allow his father to carry humiliation alone. When he arrived at the small house, his father was on the porch, sipping his tea as always. He looked up in surprise when he saw his son approaching. "You didn't need to come," the old man said softly, though his eyes betrayed relief. "Yes, I did," the sniper replied firmly. He sat beside his father, their silence heavy but full of unspoken understanding. Finally he said, "You taught me to stay calm. You taught me dignity, but you also taught me that there is a time to stand." His father sighed, shaking his head. "I don't want you to make this worse. I chose silence because I know who I am. I don't need their respect to have dignity." The son turned to him, his eyes sharp, his voice steady. "And I know who I am, Dad. I'm the man you raised. I will not let them walk away thinking they can treat you like that. This isn't about revenge. This is about truth, about showing them who you are and who stands behind you." The old man's eyes softened. He had always known his son carried fire in his blood, but he also knew he carried discipline. If anyone could confront this injustice without chaos, it was him. The sniper rose to his feet, his movements calm, deliberate. "I'm going to speak to them. They think they scared you. They need to learn the truth." His father called after him. "Remember, violence is easy. Respect is harder." The son nodded slowly. "I know, but sometimes respect has to be demanded before it's given." He walked away, his posture straight, his eyes focused. The same calm he carried on the battlefield now guided him through the streets of his own city. He wasn't going to shout. He wasn't going to fight. But when he found those officers, when he stood before them, they would see something in his eyes that no training academy had ever prepared them for. The gaze of a man who had faced war and survived. They had harassed an old bus driver. They had mocked someone they believed powerless. Now they would face his son, the most deadly Green Beret sniper ever trained. And when they saw him, when they heard his words, they would understand that their arrogance had consequences they had never imagined. The precinct parking lot was quiet that evening, shadows stretching long under the orange glow of the streetlights. The two officers, the same ones who had mocked and shoved the elderly bus driver, leaned against their cruiser, laughing carelessly. To them, it had been nothing more than another day of flexing power. They thought the old man had gone home defeated, powerless to do anything, but they didn't know someone was watching. A tall figure approached from the far end of the lot, his steps steady, his eyes sharp. He wore no uniform, carried no weapon, but his presence was heavy, commanding. Every step seemed deliberate, like a soldier marching toward his objective. It was the bus driver's son. The laughter faded as the officers noticed him coming closer. "Can we help you?" one asked with a smirk, his tone mocking as always. But there was unease in his voice. the kind that comes when instincts whisper that something is not right. The man stopped a few feet away, his gaze locked on them. His silence was powerful, sharper than words. The air between them tightened. Finally he spoke, his voice low, calm, but carrying a weight that made the officers straighten unconsciously. "You put your hands on my father." The smirk on one officer's face faltered. "Your father? Who's your father?" "The bus driver," the man replied evenly. "The man you mocked. The man you shoved. The man who stood in silence while you abused your badges." The officers exchanged a glance. One scoffed. "Look, if you're here to complain," the man's voice cut through him like a blade. "This isn't a complaint. This is a lesson." Something in his eyes made them both shift uncomfortably. There was no anger in his face, no raised voice, no wild gestures. Instead, there was discipline, control, and a dangerous calm. The kind of calm only found in men who have walked into war and walked out alive. The second officer crossed his arms. "And who exactly do you think you are?" The man stepped closer, his gaze never wavering. "I am his son. I am a Green Beret sniper. I have served in places you can't pronounce, fought battles you will never understand, and taken shots you wouldn't even see coming. I've carried men on my back through fire, watched friends fall beside me, and survived where death was certain. And yet the strongest man I have ever known is my father, the man you tried to humiliate." The officers froze. His words struck like thunder. The weight of his presence pressed on them heavier than any weapon could. "You see an old bus driver," he continued, his voice sharp with controlled fury. "I see the man who taught me honor, who taught me respect, who built me into who I am. You tried to strip him of dignity, but dignity isn't yours to give or take. It belongs to him, and now you answer for what you did." The first officer tried to recover, scoffing nervously. "Look, we were just doing our job." "Your job?" The son snapped, his voice still calm but cold as steel. "Your job is to serve, to protect, to uphold justice. Not to mock the weak, not to shove the elderly, not to use your badge like a weapon. You forgot what it means to wear that uniform, and I'm here to remind you." The silence that followed was crushing. The officers shifted on their feet, their arrogance draining under the weight of his words. They could see now that this man was different, not just in his words, but in his very being. His eyes carried the look of someone who had stared down enemies far deadlier than them and never flinched. One of them swallowed hard. "So what? What do you want from us?" The man stepped even closer, his face inches from theirs. "I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that the man you mocked has a son who sees everything. That every insult you threw at him, you threw at me. And that next time you think about using your power to humiliate someone, you'll hear my voice in your head." He leaned back slightly, his final words hitting like a hammer. "Because I am not afraid of you. And I never will be." The officers stood frozen, their arrogance shattered. For the first time they felt small, not because of threats, but because of the undeniable presence of a man who carried true authority. Earned, not given. Without another word, the Green Beret turned and walked away, his back straight, his steps calm. He didn't need to raise his hands. He didn't need to shout. His silence, his discipline, and his truth had spoken louder than anything else. The officers said nothing. They couldn't. They knew deep inside that they had just been confronted by someone far beyond their measure, someone who embodied real strength. And that night, for the first time, they understood respect, not because they had been forced, but because they had seen what it truly looked like. The old bus driver sat on his porch the next morning, the rising sun painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold. He held his usual cup of tea, steam curling into the cool air. His face was calm, as it always was, but his heart carried the weight of the past days, the humiliation, the silence, the confrontation his son had gone to face. He did not know what had happened between his boy and those officers, but he trusted him. His son was not reckless. He was disciplined, forged by years of service, sharpened by battles the world would never know about. As he sat there, neighbors began to stop by. Word had spread quickly. Some had seen the videos online. Others had heard whispers of what his son had done. They spoke with admiration now, not just for the son, but for the father who had raised him. "You must be proud," one neighbor said softly. The old man only nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. Later that day, as the bus rolled along its usual route, something was different. The passengers looked at the elderly driver with new eyes. They didn't just see an old man in a faded uniform. They saw dignity that could not be broken, a man who had endured insult with grace, a man whose quiet strength had inspired his son to act. Many passengers offered kind words as they stepped off. "We're with you. You didn't deserve what happened. You're stronger than them." The driver simply nodded at each one, his face calm. He never sought pity or praise. All he ever wanted was respect. And now slowly it was being returned to him, not because he demanded it, but because his actions and his silence had earned it. That evening, as the bus pulled into the depot, he found two familiar figures waiting near the entrance, the same officers. His heart tightened, but this time their faces carried no arrogance, no smirks. They stood straighter, their expressions heavy with something he had not seen before: shame. The first officer stepped forward. His voice was quieter than the old man remembered. "Sir, we came to apologize." The driver studied them silently, saying nothing. The second officer cleared his throat, his eyes avoiding the old man's gaze. "We were wrong. We disrespected you. We treated you unfairly, and we paid for it." The bus driver finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Respect is not weakness. You thought you could take it from me, but you cannot. Respect lives in how a man carries himself." The officers nodded, shame heavy in their posture. "Your son made that clear," one admitted. We didn't know who you were." The old man's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone never wavered. "That's the mistake you made. You thought respect should depend on who someone is. A title, a position, a name. But respect should never depend on those things. It should be given to everyone. Even if I was just an old man driving a bus, especially then." The silence that followed was powerful. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their arrogance stripped away. They had thought themselves untouchable. Now they understood the weight of their actions. One officer finally said, "You're right. And we're sorry, truly." The bus driver nodded slowly, his dignity intact. He didn't need their apology to know who he was, but hearing it was enough. He turned toward his bus, ready to head home. That night his son came by again. They sat together on the porch, the quiet between them filled with unspoken pride. Finally the father said, "You didn't need to do what you did." The son looked at him, his eyes firm but gentle. "Yes, I did. You taught me respect, Dad. You taught me strength. I couldn't let them treat you like you were less than what you are. Not while I'm alive." The old man's eyes softened. "And what am I, son?" The Green Beret smiled faintly. "The strongest man I've ever known." For the first time in days, the old bus driver laughed, a deep, warm laugh that echoed into the night. He realized then that respect wasn't restored because his son confronted the officers. It was restored because dignity cannot be destroyed. It can only be hidden for a while, waiting for the right moment to shine again. From that day forward, the community saw the old driver differently. Not as just a man behind the wheel of a bus, but as a symbol of strength, humility, and endurance. And they saw his son as proof that values passed quietly from father to child can echo louder than any insult, louder than any abuse of power. The cops had thought they could humiliate an old man. Instead, they had exposed their own weakness and reminded everyone what true strength looks like. And so, the elderly driver returned to his routine, his hands steady on the wheel, his passengers safe under his care. Life went on, but the respect he carried with him now was stronger than ever. Earned not through titles or force, but through silence, dignity, and a son who would never let the world forget his father's worth.